taking the plant's immune system, they take it back to the hive, they transform it in the hive, they process it in the hive, they add wax, and they use it in a whole variety of ways, both structurally and in a very fine and subtle way to defend the hive against both real predators, i.e. mice, lizards, moths or whatever, and microbial predators. Now resins have always been important in natural medicine, and in our natural medicine company we sell all sorts of resins, and many of them have antibacterial properties. So there's the sort of primary clue about what propolis is. It's resin which they transform in the hive, which they kind of elevate to another level. I might just throw in here that the temperature inside a beehive is very, very close to our body. So the kind of movement from plant to bee man, there's a picture there, using my intuition and imagination here, by the way. But science and research is beginning to kind of illustrate how this actually works. But it's been illustrated in my case from a hunch, what we call a hunch, but actually I think it's just common sense, and it's believing in your common sense, and then doing the work. So you're not casting around across an enormous range of possibilities. You're guiding your thinking and your research. Good, proper science, yeah, there's a role for that, but you're guiding it into an area where you think the solution is. So what's in propolis? Well, there's resins, there's the waxes. There's resins account for maybe about 30 to 50%. There's the waxes and fatty acids, about 30%. There's essential oils, there's pollen. There's an enormous range of trace elements, vitamins and minerals. It is by the time the bee has processed it, a phenomenally complex substance. There has always been an argument that, well, what's special about propolis? Isn't it just tree resin? We'll just, isn't it easy just to use pine bud resin or frankincense or myrrh or some other sort of plant resin? But actually, a number of researchers have shown that the bees actually do transform the chemicals in propolis, creating this extremely complex product. How do they use it? Well, they use it structurally. They put propolis into every cell, and I think it was a Russian researcher showed that if a natural bee comb, that beautiful paraboloid shape, if a natural bee comb only had wax in, it simply would not stand up. And it's the resins that provide the resin reinforcement of the honeycomb. But they also polish out every cell with it, making it impervious to moisture. They cap the cell with it. They make the air holes out of it, and of course they make the labyrinthine entrance to the hive with it, hence the name. And I think that it obviously works in lots of different ways, in very simple physical ways and in more complex pharmacological ways. But I often think of that entrance as a bit like, you probably won't remember it, but you used to have to get into a swimming pool, you used to have to walk through a chlorinated pool, It's a bit like the bees have made this like little chlorinated pool that they all kind of waddle through, and it brushes, propolis brushes against them all, so they're being disinfected kind of as they go into the hive. So it's used in all sorts of ways, but it's been used as a medicine by the Egyptians, the Greeks. Hippocrates talks about propolis and its ability to cure sores. The Romans used it. The Arabs used it in some of the sort of medicinal texts from the Arab world show how they used it extensively. And it was used in medicine in this country, but not as much as in Europe, and particularly in Eastern Europe. But it was a Danish man, Dr. Agard Lund, who did a lot of research and claims to have looked at 50,000 patients, treated 50,000 patients with propolis. And it would take me too long to read the list of conditions that he said responded to propolis with. And here's a fundamental problem with propolis, because I've been talking to doctors about propolis for a long time. And I can remember when I first started, they'd say, well, what does it do? And I'd say, well, it's antibiotic, anti-inflammatory, antifungal, antioxidant, anti-tumoral, antiviral. And you could just see their eyes glaze over. As if to say, is this man completely here? I mean, pharmaceutical companies are spending trillions of dollars, to license these very sort of targeted drugs. But the problem is, and this is how I've come to kind of understand it, and I think it's now being sort of illustrated with some of the work that we're doing. What propolis is like a whole. It is the immune system, and by what it does, it doesn't go in like American smart missiles to kill targeted baddies. And incidentally, they usually miss, but anyway, also kill lots of innocent bystanders, and that's what it does to our immune system. It doesn't do that. It doesn't go in from the top, antibiotic, antiviral, let's get the viruses, it goes in from the bottom, and it enables your body to be antibiotic, to antiviral, anti-inflammatory. So it's completely different, and it's the way I think all natural medicines work. So it's not surprising that something like propolis has all these different properties. What's surprising is that we think from in an upside down way. So Dr. Lund did some brilliant work, and a guy called Rémy Chauvin, who's a doctor in France, he said this in 1970. The amazing fact, however, is that bee propolis has 100% killing effect on bacteria. No other antibiotic has this total effect. With the introduction of bee propolis, it's possible that we can one day abolish many drug-related chemicals and their side effects. I'll just tell you about one little piece of research that was done in Eastern Europe, particularly in Russia. Propolis never stopped being used. It was not. They didn't have a system of patented medicines, because it was communism, if you remember. And they didn't have that. They didn't have that system. So actually, lots of research carried on being done into natural medicines to see whether it worked, not whether we could, license a medicine and make a bomb out of it, but to see whether it worked. And at the Kazan Veterinary Institute, where they did some amazing stuff on propolis, two scientists looked at the combination between antibiotics and propolis, and they found that when you put propolis with antibiotics, they said it improved the antibiotic by between 10 and 100 times. Now, and that work's been repeated, and the effect is the same. Now, whether it's improving the effect of the antibiotic or whether it's just propolis itself is a moot point. Certainly, I've repeated much of the antibiotic work, and it has strong antibiotic properties. Because, as I said, it's not antibiotic. It's in a way, it's more like a probiotic. It's stopping bacteria from growing. So how does it work then? You know, doctors will always ask you, what's the pathway of propolis? And there was some work done in Germany in the 80s by a guy called Ben Hafstein, and he was looking at the flavonoids in propolis. There's a lot of flavonoids in phenols in propolis, and what he found was that if you take a virus, for example, viruses have a protein coating in, and they're only dangerous when the protein coating breaches and the virus, as it were, drops into the body and becomes active. What Hafstein found was that the flavonoids seal up that protein coating. They seal it up and stop it becoming active. So it's not about killing, it's about disabling. It's negotiation rather than I can never remember that American saying which involves something and or, you know, but it's not about carpet bombing. It's about it's about negotiation. It's about balance. It's about ecology. It's about the ecology of the body, and it's probably about realizing that but viruses and bacteria, they all have a real role in our life. It couldn't be otherwise. And it's not that they're all bad guys, and of course we're realizing that now. But the interesting thing about that is that we know that if a mouse or something gets into the hive, the bees can kill it, but they can't move it. And some of you may have seen this. They'll basically embalm the mouse in propolis, and then they'll coat it in wax. And you can go back to that. You can go back to that mouse 10, 15 years later, and it will be perfectly preserved. Which is why the pharaohs used propolis and honey as their embalming material. So, in a way, it's a little bit as above, so below. You know, the physical use of propolis, that kind of sealing up of the mouse, actually is exactly the same model that takes place at a sort of microbiological level. And science has shown it. Another really interesting bit of research was some work done by some guys developing drugs in the US, and this was only a few years ago, and they were working with things called quorum sensors. Quorum sensors are the triggers which tell bacteria to get together and become battalions, get organized. And biofilm is basically organized bacteria. Plaque is biofilm. MRSA films, they're all biofilm, and they're dangerous because your immune system can deal with bacteria that are just sort of floating around. But when they get organized, they've got transport systems, communication systems. You know, they're really organized. They're like an army, and that's why they are so dangerous in things like MRSA, but apart from the element of resistance as well. Now, these guys at Tufts University were looking for something that interfered with this quorum sensor, this little thing that went out and said, right lads, let's get together. And they reckon they'd found this drug, but right at the end of the paper they said, but there are two natural products that do this naturally. One is cranberry and the other was propolis. So there again, there's the clue. You know, that propolis is working by disabling the mechanisms that lead to danger in the body. They're rebalancing the kind of ecology. I'm going to tell you about another little piece of research right now, although I think it fits in probably better later on. There was a mathematician called Barbara Shipman who was the daughter of the food and drug, the agricultural guy who was responsible for bees in America. She was the daughter. She grew up in this small house, and it was so small that he had to keep all his bee books in her bedroom. I think this is another element of the story thing. And she grew up and she went to Harvard and she became a mathematician. And eventually she did some work on quantum physics. And as you probably know, at quantum level, you get reality, physical reality suddenly disappears, and you get the Heisenberg principle of uncertainty, that things stop acting in a physical way. You enter a non-physical world effectively, and of course there's a scientific theory that explains that, but it doesn't explain it to me. Anyway, she's looking at these flag forms, and very complex, multi-dimensional forms. And what she sees is these figure of eights in them. And she says, she starts thinking, oh, I've seen this before. And of course she remembers the waggle dance and the figure of eight, which has a little waggle in the middle. And I came across this. I came across this work when I was thinking a lot about kind of colony collapse disorder, and just wondering what that really was, with all these sort of competing theories. And basically, the theory that I came up with was the bees had just had enough. Yeah, give up, give in, you know. But why did they give up? Well, it's like they're leaving home and they're leaving brood and food and honey. They're going out and they don't seem to be able to find their way back. Well, they don't come back. And it seems to me that, and then there's all this great debate about bees, you know, well, they can't have, you know, they've only got a tiny brain. How do they work out this waggle dance? How do they work out? Well, it seems to me that the answer is a bit like migrating birds. There's an element of their being which actually is not in the physical. It's in the superphysical, it's the non-physical. And I think this what she was looking at, and she was absolutely castigated by this. Could I take it at the end? Do you mind?
I was just realising to what you just said. It's the actual. It was the what she designed. She was asked to make a flag manifold with a quark.
Yes.
The smallest unit.
Yes.
And that was actually what she was working on, and she found is actually exactly the same shape as the bee. So
yes.
Actually,
yeah.
That's the direct shape of that particular.
Well, I tried to get in touch with her because I thought this was so interesting, but if you Google her, you'll find that she got into a lot of trouble with the scientific establishment, and I think she just pushed it away. But I think actually she was very much onto something. So after I left my first very successful company, I used the word left in a humorous way. I decided I was going to start again, and in a way, this is also the way things work. You know, I mean, at the time I thought, well, nothing worse could have happened to me, but in a way, it also provided that kind of stimulus, which seems to be the thing which actually does bring about that kind of creative. And I was saying to somebody was saying to me actually at supper, well, we wouldn't be doing some of the things we are doing now in terms of change if we didn't have to do them. And there's a profound truth there, isn't there? So I wrote a book about propolis. I looked at everything. This was in 2001. I looked at all the research, and I was really surprised at how much research had been done, even in the West, even at that time. And I listed all the research we'd done about the pharmacological properties and all the clinical research and so on, and all the diseases that it had been used to treat. And I won't bore you with all the with indications. Here's the book. If you want to actually look at that older research, it's all in the book. But what I also did was that I applied for a research and development award, which was, it used to be called a SMART award, and we were the first company, first natural medicine company to get a research and development award, and it was worth about £75,000, which was a huge amount of money, and I invested that in a PhD program for someone up at University of Strathclyde, and that was 7 years ago. The guy who agreed to supervise the PhD when I first went up there, he took us to lunch, and the PhD student that I wanted to do it, and he was quite interested, not to say slightly amused by the idea of investigating propolis as a natural medicine, but it was an extremely nice person, and we've got on famously ever since. And actually only a month ago he said to me about a piece of research which I'll tell you about in a minute. He said, "Do you know, James," he said, I feel now with this research, I'm so excited by it, I feel as if it really makes it work. It really explains why I'm a scientist. It really makes me feel that I'm doing something that's really worthwhile." So in 7 years, he's also been on a journey. So he's not quite so amused anymore. He's actually very excited about the work that we're doing. There has been a huge amount of research published over the last 10 years in the West, I say the West, Japan. There's a lot of work being done in Korea, and we've done a significant amount of work in the UK, and I'd just like to tell you a bit about that work, because we started out by trying to collect as many different samples of propolis as we could. And I think to date we've collected somewhere around 400 samples of propolis from the whole globe. So if you can imagine that nice little map with pins in and things, we're now beginning to understand the chemical and to some extent the pharmacological properties of propolis from different regions. And the chemistry of propolis varies phenomenally. A very broad brush view of this. If you do what's called a high performance liquid chromatograph, which is like a fingerprint, it ends up looking like the Alps, with lots of big and small peaks. And if you look at temperate climate propolis, which was the only propolis available sort of 20 years ago commercially, you'd see really big peaks of usually flavonoids, and there were some key flavonoids there: pinosembrin, galangin, chrysin, quercetin, and we actually set a standard for the industry based on the levels of these big peaks. Then the Brazilians started producing propolis, but their propolis had a similar kind of fingerprint, except the peaks were much smaller, so everybody said, "Oh well, that's rubbish." Ours is much better, because theirs are smaller peaks. The only problem was they were really effective. They had a really positive effect, and the Brazilians have done a huge amount of, I think, fantastic work. And then I wanted to look at African propolis. We've got lots of samples from different countries in Africa, and there it was almost a flat line. So everybody said, "Well, that is rubbish."
That's Africa for you.
Yeah, that's. But there was a really interesting end to that story, because commercially, everybody just forgot about it. There's no point in collecting that stuff because it just isn't there. But as I said, Brazilian propolis was a problem really for the kind of marketeers, because it had much smaller peaks, and yet it was still effective. So why is that? I mean, the reality is absolutely obvious. You know, bees have to develop an external immune system that suits the situation they find themselves in, and they get that from the situation in which they find themselves in, by taking it from the plants which have already developed the system they need to develop to protect themselves in their environment. So we looked at all these samples of propolis and started looking at their chemical, and of course to start with it just seemed how are we going to make sense of all this? Bearing in mind, you know, you're thinking about drugs. How are you going to standardize something that comes in 355,000 different models? It's just a nightmare. That's a nightmare. It's not so much a nightmare if you were to think of it the other way round. Does it do something? Does it have an antibacterial effect? Never mind what's in it, you know. Does it do something? Is it safe? You know. So we started trying to do that, and the woman who had taken on to the PhD actually came up with a really interesting thought. She looked at all these samples, and then she superimposed a climate map on the top of it, and she looked at propolis that had come from wet, hot places, and propolis that had come from hot, dry places, and propolis that had come from temperate climates and so on. And she found, for instance, that the antibacterial property of propolis was strongest, guess where it needed to be, where it was very warm and very hot, because bacteria like to grow in those conditions. So the propolis that was produced turned out to be, you know, the strongest. If you're talking antibacterial, then you get the strongest antibacterial propolis from areas where it's very hot and very wet, because that's where the greatest challenge. That's where you know. I mean, am I mad thinking this is obvious? You know,
It's obvious.
but it's obvious. But it's obvious, isn't it?
Yeah.
But somehow you have to cling to the obvious sometimes, don't you? And really, that was the kind of spark that suddenly made this great complex mass of information that we gathered all become simpler. And then we found some. I don't know how I'm doing for time.
I haven't got the timekeeping device.
5 to 8.
And then we found. So we found this link between function, pharmacological function, and climate, which was quite a breakthrough, really. I thought. And the way we did this, we used something called principal component analysis, because when you're looking at a massive information, like you're looking at 300 chemicals, possibly, all variable, how do you make sense of that? Well, principal component analysis is a really smart way of looking at very, very big sets of data. I mean, it could be your inside leg measurement, you know, of the universe, where it could be anything. It doesn't have to be about propolis. It could be any kind of data. It looks at all that data, and it looks for patterns in the data, and it kind of simplifies them out. I think of it a bit like a very, very long algebraic equation, and it's looking for E equals 2 minus 12 there, and cancelling it out there, and it turns a massively complicated set of data into a number. You know, so then you plot these numbers onto a matrix, and it was really interesting, because we found that all the numbers between I'm just making it up, 148 and 162, all those numbers all came from China, and 4,228 to 4,700 and what all came from Brazil, and so on. So you know, as it were, the number suddenly became so. Suddenly, we also sort of alighted on something that, on a way of standardizing and understand and authenticating a material, and identifying it in connection with its headline capacity, because all propolis has all of those properties, because it has to have, because it's the immune defense mechanism, but some propolis has different properties according to the environment in which the bee finds itself. And then something really interesting happened, and that was one of the chemists up at the University of Strathclyde, who've been doing all this work. She decided to leave the, I think it was a mass spectrometry device. She decided to leave it on, instead of just watching the peaks up to there. She decided to look there, and lo and behold, she found these other chemicals on the end where we'd not been looking, and she came up with she said, well, this is really odd. There's two samples. She said, and one of the samples contains this chemical that's really active against sleeping sickness. It's an anti-trypanosome. I've had to really struggle to learn these words. They sound good though, don't they? It contained these chemicals, and that was some propolis from the Cameroon, from an area where there is sleeping sickness. Ding. And there was another one. She said, but I can't understand, because this other propolis is from the Solomon Islands. Oh, incidentally, where there is sleeping sickness is a protozoa, and it grows in dry, hot conditions. But the other sample was, she said, was from the Solomon Islands, and that's very wet and hot there. So we couldn't kind of understand this. We thought we were on something. But the professor who was running the research, he came down to see me, and I said it's a bit of a mystery, that. So I went back to look at all the samples. I kept all the samples, and I found that the one to the Solomon Islands had actually been mislabeled, and actually was also from the Cameroon. So suddenly, and now they're doing now they've really extended the project, and are looking. They've also found that in other areas, including Zambia and Tanzania, where the propolis has been collected from areas where there's sleeping sickness, the propolis has these anti-trypanosomes. And where they've looked at the propolis that comes from an area which doesn't have sleeping sickness, it doesn't have that chemical. To me, that's a whole concept of medicine.
Yeah.
You know, to me that just breaks the rules, because basically what it's saying is that the beehive is a sort of flying pharmacy, and it's basically producing the drugs you need for the diseases in that area.
It's like an immune system, isn't it?
Exactly.
If there's the problem, then
it's the world. It's the universe as one, you know, and it's acting as a coherent, integrated system to. And bear in mind, you know, this thing about the beehive. I mean, Rudolf Steiner talked about bees as being rather like blood corpuscles, you know, and which even further strengthens the idea of the beehive as a body, as a whole, you know, and the temperature is the same as in our body, as near as damn it, you know. So the kind of carryover in terms of the value of these products, if we can get the right kind of quality products, I think is just it's just enormous. So we've now got a very substantial research program looking at, and I mean, I'm thinking, well let's have a look at areas where there's malaria, because malaria is a protozoa as well, you know. So I mean, you know, my overexcited brain is telling me, you know, we're going to get a Nobel Prize for this. You know, at least. You know, because I suppose the difficulty is that in terms of Western people, the population moves around, they're subject to all sorts of influences, but you know, in terms of maybe helping with some of the real killer problems in Africa, for instance, the answer is right spot there where you are. And we don't have to buy into the kind of expensive, you know, synthetic drug syndrome. It may well be that some of our answers are right there. In practical terms, propolis is sold as a food. It's not a herb. It's not subject to the crazy European legislation that's just hit herbal medicine, and we produce herbal medicine too. It doesn't affect us quite so much because we sell to practitioners and not retail, but propolis is a food, so you're all right with propolis so long as you don't make any claims. But for instance, I can't publish the research that we've done and say that propolis is is antibiotic or whatever it is, not in connection with selling products. I should also say the other interesting thing we found, the propolis from the Solomon Islands turned out to be very effective against MRSA, and they went on to fractionate the sample that we'd got, as they do, the pharmacologists. They fractionated it and they found a prenulated flavonoid which was even more effective against MRSA than the whole product, the whole of the propolis product. So they all start getting very excited. We've got a new drug and so on. I said, well, just hang on a minute. So what? You know, that's what antibiotics are. You know, it'll work for 8 months and then we'll be back in the same position, only worse. Anyway, fortunately, no funder has come forward for that research. So we're pressing on, particularly with the sleeping sickness research. Now, so there's a whole kind of concept that I call kind of geographic medicine. So I've explained it. It's that if you like, the bee is the sort of transformer, as it were, of the plant's response to its kind of health environment, and creates these products which are necessary for the bee to maintain its own immune system, and that there's a very positive crossover to human beings, which we found from looking at all the rest of the research in terms of its clinical applications. So we're pursuing that, but in practice it's very difficult to think about actually signing up to kind of developing drugs, because it's just so very difficult. Although it could be that using principal component analysis we can set standards which would be ultimately acceptable to the MHRA, the Medicine and Healthcare Regulatory Agency, in terms of a licensing process which is actually completely inimical to natural products. But it may happen, but I think the problem probably will have to get a bit worse before then. But we can't make any claims whatsoever, which is why I haven't told you anything. But the thing is, if propolis is like that, we also know, for instance, that Manuka honey. Now, Manuka honey is a very interesting success story. I think it's a very interesting marketing success story, because the test for Manuka honey, you might have heard of it, the UMF, which was developed by these people at Waikato University and Professor Peter Molan. UMF stands for unique Manuka factor. I always think they must have stayed up all night thinking about that one. But the test is the same test that you do to test the amount of, how Dettol says kills 99% of all bacteria. That's the test they use. That's the test they use. It has got a bit more complex than that, and there is something about the tea tree plant, which is the tea tree, which is what Manuka comes from, that does bring the plant obviously does bring something special to the party. And the Brazilians, in an area called Minas Gerais, which was devastated by mining at the turn of the century, the only plant that grew there was this plant called Baccharis draconifolia, which is a sort of dwarf rosemary type bush, and it tends to become cancerous because of the way the ground's been polluted. But the bees love this plant. They go to this plant and they bite down into the buds. They bite right down into the buds, and they suck up the resin from these buds, take it back to the hive, and guess what? It turns out to be highly cytotoxic. So, company in Brazil marketing this product as a cancer treatment, and they'll probably eventually get closed down because it must be, it must be wrong. It must be another lateral or another wacky cancer treatment. Which is. But there's a lot of work now. There's a lot of work that's been done on the use of propolis in treating cancer. It's not that these sorts of things are cures, particularly when diseases are chronic, because the way they work best is to help your body to sustain itself. But so it's not just propolis. There's honey. There's a lot of work coming out on bee venom. There's a huge amount of work that's been done about pollen. We have a new brand of medicines here, which I call epiceuticals, and I'm trying to convince the North York Moors Park to. This is not a very good model, but it was the first one that we did. But this is a model of a building I hope to build in North Yorkshire, the Epiceutical Research Centre, which will have twin aims. One will be the development and understanding and education about sustainable beekeeping, and the other will be the development, education and understanding of sustainable medicine, i.e. epiceuticals. Because obviously there can't be sustainable medicines from the beehive if we don't have sustainable beekeeping. So, and this is it's in the North York Moors Park. So they absolutely love the idea, but of course, like all planning authorities, they've been very difficult. But it'll probably happen. But in October. I decided that before we build the building, we'll actually have a conference, and I'm bringing together all the academics who are working in the UK that I know of on epiceutical. So there are all the people that we've been working with at Strathclyde. There's a team of about 4 or 5 people now, and there's a team of 2 people at the University of Bradford, including the director of the Centre for Pharmaceutical Engineering. We now have a full-time chemist who has been working on propolis, developing propolis products in India, and he's now come to work with us. And he has been working with Professor Paradkar in Bradford. And there are various people around the country, including Professor Rose Cooper, who's been doing some confirmatory work on honey. And so we're trying to bring all these people together, including some people from Europe that we've had a lot of contact with, some people from the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. So we're going to have this small conference, and it'll be the first conference. It was the first conference of the Epiceutical Research Centre, and I feel it kind of plugs in very nicely to what's happening here. I think we're kind of on the same page. So in a way, I guess that's kind of the end of the story, really. Well, it's not the end of the story, but it's kind of the end of this mini story because other things call.
Are you willing to take questions now?
Yeah.
Okay, 5 minutes of questions.